Arizona, a land where the sun paints the desert gold by morning and burns secrets to ash by noon. It was in this sun-cracked wilderness that a story began, not with gunfire nor a chase, but with something quieter, stranger. A disappearance so clean, so surgical, it felt like the desert itself had swallowed it whole. On a dusty May morning in 1977, a pair of seasoned couriers, Cecil Newkirk and Russell Dempsey, loaded $333,000 in hard cash into an armored transport. The vault door clanged shut behind them with bureaucratic finality. This was routine. A straight-line haul from Phoenix to Flagstaff, nothing out of the ordinary. At least, not yet. But fate has a way of hiding in the details. Before the truck could roll out, one of the men noticed something off. The side door's latch. Loose. Unreliable. Not something you ignore when you're hauling hundreds of thousands through open highway. So they waited for repairs. A minor delay, they thought, just a blip. Only later would it become clear. That single hour was all the time a predator needed. By late morning, the armored truck was finally moving. Highway miles unrolled beneath it like a ticking metronome. The couriers were heading north, unaware they'd already fallen behind schedule. Banks along the route began to wonder, where was the cash? Where were the men? At 10:30 a.m., a concerned branch picked up the phone. "They're running late," came the reply from dispatch. "Mechanical trouble. Nothing serious." But the hours wore on. No truck, no radio call. Just a silence that grew heavier with every passing mile. By late afternoon, the transport company could no longer pretend it was a delay. The vehicle and the men inside had simply vanished. And when silence stretches too long in the desert, the only thing louder is the fear. That's when the FBI stepped in. Not the uniformed patrols or the county sheriff's boys. No, this case was handed off to the Bureau, agents trained to trace shadows, to read between footprints and lies. Within hours, a regional alert was sounded. Roads were locked down. Choppers swept over the cactus-thorned landscapes of Interstate 17. What they were hunting for wasn't just a vehicle. It was a ghost. The next morning, Arizona State Police pilots spotted something odd near a speck of civilization called Bumblebee, barely more than a dot on the map. There, nestled 400 meters off-road, sat an armored truck, alone, waiting, as if someone had parked it there like a stolen memory. Law enforcement closed in. FBI agents moved first, methodical, silent, guns holstered but ready. The vehicle was sealed. No damage, no signs of a firefight, just the eerie stillness of abandonment. When they finally unlocked the doors, what they found inside only thickened the air. The radio had been left on, still humming static, as if the couriers had tried to reach out or never got the chance. The shotgun secured inside the cab hadn't been touched, and the alarm system, untouched, untriggered. Worse still, the money was no longer complete. Several heavy sacks of coins remained, but $293,000 in banknotes, gone, lifted with precision. Yet it wasn't just what was missing that troubled the agents. It was what they did find. Splotches of blood on the floor, faint stains on the canvas money bags. No bodies, no bullet casings, just enough crimson to whisper that someone had been hurt, and that whoever did it had cleaned up with care. Outside, the wind dragged sand over a scattering of footprints. Not 2 sets, 4. 2 belonged to the missing couriers. The others, unknown. Nearby, a second set of tire impressions told a story of their own. Someone else had driven away from this hidden clearing. Another vehicle, one that hadn't come in peace. The Bureau's agents knelt, measured, photographed, cast the impressions in plaster. Nothing was overlooked, because this wasn't just a robbery anymore. It was an operation, cold, calculated, and crafted with military precision. And in the center of it all, mystery waiting to be unburied. The desert doesn't forget. It buries things, yes, but always leaves something behind for those who know how to look. In the FBI, they were listening. Not to what was loud, but to what was missing. 2 men, 1 truck, nearly $300,000, gone without a trace. And yet that truck hadn't vanished into legend. It had been abandoned, methodically, miles off any known route. Someone had gone through a great deal of trouble to make the couriers disappear, but not the vehicle. That told the Bureau everything they needed to know. This wasn't panic. It was planning. The next step? Eyes on the ground and questions in the wind. Federal agents cast their net wide, feeding out details to the public, descriptions of the vehicle, the names of the missing men, times, locations. They knew someone out there had seen something, and soon enough, the calls began. A few reported glimpses of the armored truck paused on the shoulder of I-17 on the morning of the heist. That in itself wasn't unusual. Couriers took breaks. But one detail stuck like a thorn in the case file. A man in uniform standing beside the truck. One witness swore it was a highway patrol officer, clean-cut, authoritative. Another mentioned a second vehicle idling nearby. Make and color varied depending on the memory, but the presence, undeniable. So the FBI reached out to the Arizona Department of Public Safety. If one of their officers had pulled the truck over, there'd be a record. Routine procedure. But there wasn't, not a single log. No officer had made a stop on an armored vehicle that day. That one revelation shifted everything. The moment it landed, it redefined the nature of the crime. If it wasn't one of ours, one agent said, then someone was playing dress-up. Someone impersonated law enforcement. That wasn't a heist. That was subversion. The Bureau doubled down. They retraced the route mile by mile. Boots on the pavement, eyes in the sky. And then they brought in a tracker, an old-school desert reader who could interpret the ground like a crime scene novel. He examined the site where witnesses said the truck had stopped. What he found there chilled even the agents. Signs of a struggle. The scuffed ground bore the tale of someone being forced down, pushed, pinned, or worse. Drag marks near the rear axle. Tire impressions, not from the armored truck, but from another vehicle, consistent with those later found at the Bumblebee site. It all aligned. The working theory snapped into place. Someone dressed as an officer flagged down the truck. The couriers were overpowered, likely before they could make a sound. The truck was commandeered and taken off the main road. The real job had already begun long before the first drop of blood. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a performance, rehearsed and ruthless. And now it had turned into a manhunt. The FBI, with its sharpened instincts and unyielding reach, knew one thing for certain. Whoever had orchestrated this, they weren't amateurs. They were precise, patient, and still out there. But every criminal leaves a scar on the timeline, and this one was about to bleed. Time passed, but the shadows refused to settle. Somewhere between Phoenix and Flagstaff, the truth lay hidden, like bones under scorched sand. The FBI, relentless in their pursuit, shifted their focus. If the men weren't in the desert, perhaps the water held the answers. And then, the lake gave up its first secret. It was the morning of June 16, 1977, 23 days since the armored truck vanished. 2 fishermen were casting lines into the mirrored surface of Lake Mead, hoping for a quiet morning and maybe a story to take home. What they got instead was a nightmare. A shape bobbed in the water, drifting gently near the shore. Not driftwood, not debris, a body. Local authorities responded first, but it wasn't long before the FBI arrived. Badges flashing under the rising sun, suits rolled at the sleeves. A dive team from the National Park Service was called in. What they recovered was grotesque in its message. The corpse had been left with intent. A fabric sack pulled tight over the head and shoulders. An executioner's mask, meant to erase identity. But not everything had been lost to the current. In the back pocket Waterlogged but intact was a wallet. Inside, a driver's license. The name was burned into the case file that very day. Russell Dempsey, one of the missing couriers. Grief doesn't have a volume, but that moment screamed. The desert mystery had become something darker. Blood had been spilled. Life had been taken. The FBI wasted no time. The waters of Lake Mead were searched with surgical precision. Divers combed the depths. Sonar swept the silence. And then, another fragment of the puzzle surfaced. A weapon. Not a gun, not a blade, but something far more personal. A homemade garrote, a length of rope with 2 wooden handles, tangled in underwater debris. The kind of tool built by hand for a job you wanted done quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. The body, once examined, confirmed the worst. Dempsey had been strangled. Slow, brutal. The rope had left its signature around his neck. A forensic technician noted something chilling. A single strand of hair caught in the twisted fibers. It was his. And the blow landed hardest, not just in the hearts of the agents, but in the Bureau's mandate. This wasn't just federal money lost. This was murder, cold-blooded, executed with care. The FBI changed gears. They weren't tracking thieves anymore. They were pursuing killers. Agents canvassed every marina, every boat rental shack around Lake Mead. Days of silence followed. Then, a name turned up in a rental log. A boat borrowed the day after the armored truck disappeared. The boat had been returned quietly, without damage. But the location of its return? Benelli Landing, not far from where Dempsey had surfaced. And the man who signed the form? Michael Poland. A name that meant little at the time, but would soon anchor the entire case. Sometimes evil doesn't wear a mask. Sometimes it shakes your hand and smiles. Michael Poland was no drifter, no shadow hiding under bridges. He was polished, deliberate, and on paper, just another face in the crowd. But the Bureau knew better. That name on the boat rental was no coincidence. And it wouldn't be the last time it came up. Because just when investigators began tightening the screws, another witness stepped into the light. A tow truck operator. The kind of guy who spends more time with engines than people. He came forward with a strange tale, one that seemed laughable at first, until the details came into focus. The day after the heist, he'd been called to Lake Mead. A pickup truck had rolled into the water near a fishing spot. The men who made the call? They claimed they'd been drinking, said the truck slipped into the lake by accident. Fishing trip gone wrong. But the driver noticed something that stuck with him. Drag marks. The bed of the truck had deep scrapes, parallel grooves, as if something heavy had been pulled out and dumped. He handed over a copy of the service receipt. The name signed on the line? Michael Poland. That was no longer just a name. It was a red flag in bold ink. Now the FBI had a suspect. A real one. But this kind of man doesn't work alone. So they kept digging. And they didn't have to dig far, because Michael had a brother, Patrick Poland. Younger, quieter, but just as suddenly rich. In the weeks after the robbery, both brothers, formerly unemployed, buried in debt, began spending money like the ink hadn't even dried. New cars, motorcycles, lavish items they couldn't have afforded before. Investigators watched them transform from men on the edge of ruin to men of sudden fortune. It didn't make sense. Until you lined it up with the dates. Right after May 24th, 1977, the day of the armored truck's disappearance, their financial nightmare vanished, replaced with cash. Lots of it. The FBI now had a timeline. They had motive. They had movement. But what they didn't yet have was the second courier, Cecil Newkirk, Still missing. Still silent.
But silence has its weight, and the Bureau wasn't letting go. Surveillance on the Poland brothers intensified. Every move watched, every word weighed. They weren't just gathering evidence, they were watching for cracks, and cracks were coming. The next breakthrough didn't come from a confession. It came from fabric. It was subtle, almost too subtle. A piece of fabric pulled from the depths near where Dempsey's body had been found. The water had faded its color, but not its story. FBI forensic analysts studied it closely. The weave, the stitching, the measurements. This wasn't mass-produced. This was custom work. The sack was handmade. But by who? That's when the Bureau's quiet legwork paid off. Dozens of textile shops across Phoenix were contacted, visited, and questioned. Most shrugged. A few cooperated. But one owner leaned in. He remembered the order. 3 sacks. Heavy-duty fabric. Specific dimensions. Ordered just weeks before the armored truck vanished. He still had the paperwork. The name on the receipt? Mark Harris. But that name rang a bell. It wasn't a person. It was a mask. The Bureau cross-referenced the alias and found it again, this time linked to a different receipt. A purchase made just before the heist. An electric stun gun. That stun gun had been discovered in Michael Poland's home. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was a blueprint. Michael had used the alias to gather the tools, to plan, to execute. And now the FBI had the paper trail to prove it. It was enough. On May 17, 1978, nearly a year after the bodies disappeared into the waters of Lake Mead, the Bureau made its move. They came in armored and silent. These weren't arrests, they were tactical recoveries. Michael Poland was pulled from a real estate office, still trying to sell dreams while hiding corpses. Patrick was picked up outside a business he owned, blinking into the sunlight like he'd just stepped out of a lie. Both men surrendered without a fight. But the question remained, could the FBI make it stick? There were no eyewitnesses to the killings, no direct footage, no bloody weapons with fingerprints. What they had was a mosaic, 1,000 slivers of motive, method, and movement. It would take a masterful prosecution to bring it together. But the Bureau had one more card to play, one more whisper from the dead. A man can lie, a story can bend, but time, it doesn't flinch. When FBI agents recovered the body of Cecil Newkirk, nearly a year after his partner had surfaced, there wasn't much left to speak for him. The water had done its work. But one item endured, clinging to his wrist like a final breath of truth, an automatic watch. Not digital, not battery-powered, the kind that ticks only when its wearer moves, kept alive by motion, by life. And when the Bureau's forensic team examined it, they found something that stopped them cold. The watch had frozen at 10:37 p.m. on May 26, 1977, 2 full days after the robbery. The mechanism inside proved what no witness ever could. Newkirk had still been alive, at least until the morning of May 26th. And here's the detail that sealed the fate of 2 killers. At that exact time, both Michael and Patrick Poland were confirmed, by boat receipts, by witness accounts, by FBI surveillance, to be in the Lake Mead area. The watch, in silence, told the story the court needed to hear. It became the unwavering witness. The ticking ghost that placed the brothers at the scene of a second murder. In February of 1979, a federal jury found both men guilty of armed robbery and kidnapping. 100 years in prison. But Arizona wasn't done, not by a long shot. Later that year, a state jury handed down the ultimate sentence, death. But justice, like everything else in the desert, doesn't always come clean. The convictions were appealed. The Arizona Supreme Court tossed the death penalty, citing missteps, hypnosis-tainted testimony, and questionable evidence procedures. Suddenly, the Poland brothers were eligible for parole
in less than a decade. The FBI was stunned, outraged, but not defeated. A new prosecutor stepped forward, Melvin McDonald, and pushed for something unprecedented: a second state trial. Fresh evidence, a tighter case, this time airtight. And at the heart of it all, the watch. McDonald stood before the jury and let time do the talking. This man's watch speaks from beyond the grave. It tells us when he died, and it tells us who was there when it happened. On November 18, 1982, Michael and Patrick Poland were once again convicted, this time for murder. They wouldn't escape again. Years passed. Appeals failed. Patrick Poland leader. Mercy shrank. On June 16, 1999, Michael Poland was executed by lethal injection. He went silent without remorse, cold to the very end. 9 months later, on March 15, 2000, Patrick followed. His final moments were quieter. He expressed regret, a flicker of humanity in a case defined by its absence. And so the case closed. 2 ordinary couriers vanished into the desert. 1 crime, 2 bodies, $300,000 gone. But in the end, it wasn't greed that cracked the case. It was the meticulous resolve of the FBI, their agents' refusal to let the trail grow cold, the tireless combing of evidence, the chase across sun-scorched highways and shadowed water. Every thread, every footprint, every watchful eye, they made sure justice didn't die in the dark. Because even the most careful criminals leave something behind.